there's an unwritten rule that all children, whether they're acknowledging of it or not, follow. At some point in their childhood, it is observed, and the rule is very simple. But it's one of those things that comes to define childhoods and parents during this time. The simple truth, the simple rule is simply this, that the dark is scary. Typically, this is something that a child grows out of, this fear of the dark, this fear of the unknown. Yet, even as adults, in a sense, this is still with us. We still have some issues with the dark, although as adults, ours are a little more subtle. Typically, our problem with the dark comes from the banging of shins on coffee tables, or running as fast as you can upstairs because you just turned the lights off and the lights are on upstairs. See, the problem is that the dark hides things. It changes things. It makes everything look completely different. The way that you once saw the world when it was so full of light is now completely different. And so you don't see the coffee table that you bang into. Open doors of closets or clothes strewn about become these horrible, grotesque figures to a child's imagination. What happens is the brain is taking in as much information as it possibly can. But because not all of the information is there to see the reality of the situation, it fills in the gaps. And so what is supposed to be a wadded up sweater underneath the bed becomes some monster just hanging out, waiting for a cookie or a crumb or something. Whatever happens, we are convinced that the dark is unsettling. And it's because we don't see things clearly. And that is why we as human beings, that's why we always try to seek out the light. That's why we want lights on. And that's why part of being a dad is literally just walking around turning off all the lights in the house. Because we want to see how the house is set up. We want to see where everything is. And that's what light affords us. Part of the greatness of the discovery of fire was not just that people could cook, but now they could venture further into the cave. And if you were further into the cave, you could be better protected. And all of this is because of light. Light casts its blinding brilliance over the reality of the world, and we see things for what it really is. It overcomes the darkness at every turn. The light is needed so that we can make an informed decision with all of the facts. I'd like to think that that is what's at the heart of our passage from the prophet Isaiah today. This idea that the truth has come into the world. Very famously, Jesus was asked by Pontius Pilate, "What is truth?" And the answer, of course, was, well, Jesus was the truth, because he affirmed, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. This passage from the prophet Isaiah paints this wonderful picture of darkness being driven out because light has come, this special light, this light that has come from the family of David, fulfilling the Davidic covenant. Darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. This light will cast out all darkness. All powers in the world will be shown that they are subject to the light and the power of the Lord God the Almighty. But not only that, this light has this ability to draw people in. like a happier version of a moth going to a flame. That's what this light is going to do. All of these people stumbling around in the darkness, they'll see off in this distance this bright, shining light. And the natural human inclination is there is light there, which means I can see what is really going on. And so they will be drawn to this light. There's no mistaking this imagery here. The light, of course, is Jesus, the light of the world. And we know that. We just got done celebrating the Advent season, and now we're in the Christmas season, and we celebrate Epiphany, the day the wise men came, bringing their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Jesus being the light here is fascinating. Because what Jesus is doing then is drawing all peoples to himself, casting a light on the reality of the world. And that is the real problem with darkness, remember? That things shift and change, and they look differently. They don't look how they're supposed to. And so when we have Jesus Christ as the light of the world, stepping into the darkness that the world is full of, we see very clearly the reality for the first time. A lot of times when faced with bright lights, what happens to us? They're very blinding. They're very distracting. One of the best times to go to the movie theater, for example, is at night. Because you've just spent a couple hours in a dark room watching a movie, and then when you go outside, the stars are out, there's not a lot of light, and you don't do that uncomfortable squinting thing where you look around and try to see things. Matinees, while they are much cheaper and more cost-effective, when you come out of the theater, you have to do the uncomfortable squint eye thingy to see where you parked your car. Your eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, and faced with light, faced with the reality of what the world is, it's uncomfortable to us, and it takes some time to adjust to. I like to think that Jesus Christ is exactly the same way, that once we encounter this light, at first it's this blinding brilliance that stops us dead in our tracks. But as we become accustomed to seeing Jesus Christ, not only do we see the world for what it is, but more importantly, we begin to be transformed. How then can you react if you are unable to see what's really going on? The reason we bang our shins on coffee tables all the time is not because we're stupid or lazy or ignorant, but because we don't have all of the facts. But with just a little bit of light, we're able to see where the floor ends and the coffee table begins. And therefore, we spare our shins an indignant, humiliating pain. Jesus Christ is much the same way. When faced with all of the facts and the reality of the world, we are able to change our behaviors, to change our attitudes, and to do as Christ has called us to do. And that's the problem with the light. That's why the light can sometimes be uncomfortable, because it shows the truth. You can't hide from light. You can do the best that you can to do it, but the light will still shine upon you. Turning on a lamp in your house to see where everything is, you know what it is. You can see the toys that kids left out. You can see the cups that you left out. Now in the darkness, you don't have to pay attention to all that. You can go about your day as if there's not a bunch of random things strewn about the floor. You can live with plausible deniability that the house is neat and tidy until you wake up and there's light shining in the house. Light shows what's really going on in the world. And the problem is that makes us uncomfortable because it shows us people who are hurting. It shows us people who live in fear. And it shows us how we are not reaching out and serving them. Light forces us to correct and to change our behavior given all of the information that is found in the world. The story of how how the wise men came to Jesus is a fascinating one. It starts with light. It starts with a star, as we all know, the beautiful, bright, and shining star that guides all of the people to see where the Christ child is laying. This was done in the time of King Herod. Now, Herod is a rather interesting figure. I use interesting not as an admirable way, but just in the way that one finds the villain of a story rather interesting. A figurehead to his own people, while working for the Roman government, Herod wanted power. He wanted to keep his power. And so when this light shines, this new light comes, what happens is these wise men, they take notice of this. Typically, births of kings or gods or whatever in mythology and legends and things like that, they are heralded by some shift in the heavens. A new star, a comet being strewn across the sky. All of these things point to God or gods, depending on what you're reading, doing something in the world and shifting the very fabric of reality which is displayed amongst the heavens. And so the fact that this random star appears, the wise men start digging. And what they dig and they find the book of the prophet Isaiah, who talks at length about this star and what it points to. And when they go to Herod, they say, "Where is the child who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star, and we've come to pay homage to him." Now, the wise men in this story, it's very fascinating because they're not from this area. They're foreigners. They came from someplace else. And they're doing what foreign dignitaries would do at the birth of a king. They come to pay homage to this king. And so when they look at the facts objectively, they say, bright shining star, this guy Isaiah says is going to be in Bethlehem. We need to go to Bethlehem. We need to see where the child is, because the king probably knows where that child is. You see, they go to King Herod because they automatically assume that the child who was to be a king was born to the current king, the current ruler and principality. And this freaks Herod out. He gets into a panic and a tizzy because he's like, "But I'm king. I'm the one in charge right now. I don't have an heir that I'm ready to give my throne over to. So what does all of this mean?" And so he gathers his wise people and his sages and his people who look at the stars, the astrologers, and they say, "Okay, let's figure this out. We got to figure out where this kid is." And they're looking at the stars and they're reading over the text, and finally they come across the words of the prophet Isaiah and say, "Bethlehem. That's where the child is going to be born. The child is going to be born in Bethlehem." Herod says, "Okay, I've got these guys right here. They're ready to go see the king. So I'm going to tell them, go see the king and let me know so that I can go and pay homage myself." Now we know, of course, Herod had less than altruistic motives in his heart. And we know what happens next after this, where Jesus and Mary and Joseph flee from their home and become refugees to escape being slaughtered. Because there is a horrible thing that happens because Jesus isn't there when Herod finds out. So the wise men go, and they do their foreign dignitary job. They see the king. But the reality is, it's not a palace. It's just a simple structure. I mean, they keep following this star, guided by the light, to see the reality of the world. And the reality of the world is this king, this child who is to be born King of the Jews, is not living in a life of luxury, but instead a simple home. And they knock on the door and they go in and they see Jesus and they see Mary. And there's no purple robes, there's no fancy thrones, there's no gold strewn about or chalices or incense being burned or anything. There's just a kid running around playing with his mom. But this is the king. This is the reality. And so they do what they were supposed to do as foreign dignitaries, and they pay honor to the king. And they give gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they see that something different is going on. For the first time, they have a glimpse of this historical Messiah figure who was to be born King of the Jews. This long-awaited historical king. And it's a kid. It's just a kid living in a house with his mom. But this kid, not living in the life of luxury, this is what the reality of everything is. This is what God is doing in this world, to take things and to change them and to shake them up. And this is what true power is all about. And so they get told in a dream not to go back to Herod. So when they go home, they don't do what they were supposed to do. They make a political faux pas because as a foreign dignitary, they were under the protection and the guise of the current ruler, which was King Herod. But they were told not to go back to him, but he told them to tell them where the child was. But because they had seen reality, because they had seen true power, they couldn't do it. They couldn't go back that way. Because once you see the reality of the world, there is no going back. You know where everything is. You see the clutter. You see the mess. And for us, as Christians following Jesus Christ, what do we see? We see hurt. We see heartbreak. We see pain. We see people being put down. That's the reality. The truth, the light, can be more terrifying than the dark. But the dark isn't real. All of those things we think we see in the dark, they're not real. It's not reality. It's just our mind trying to cope with the world. The real reality is we have a job to do. We have to reach out. Once we have encountered the light of the world, once we see the reality of all things, we have to be about following this light. Wherever it leads us, whatever it asks us to do, because it's real. It's the truth of the world. We don't have to be afraid of the dark. We don't have to live in the darkness anymore because we know what really is going on. The only thing we have to do is respond to the light. Amen.